Hi, everyone, and welcome. This is To Serve for Human Minds. My name is Matt MacLean. I know you have many MacLeans to choose from at this particular GCAP. Thank you for choosing me. I would like to start by thanking our sponsor, Film Victoria. Without their generosity and support, none of this would be possible. Thanks to them. This is also probably the moment where I should tell you to silence your smartphones and no flash photography because it startles the monkey upstage. And you're probably wondering who this guy is and why he pretends to know anything about game development. As I said, my name is Matt MacLean. I've been working on games professionally since 2004. I got started in a little studio that's now defunct in Denver, in the United States, called Worlds Apart. I worked on some trading card games, including one for the Lord of the Rings and a game called Star Chamber. They're both very near and dear to my heart, but as online services, they no longer exist, so you can't play them. In 2006, I made the move to California to join Obsidian Entertainment, where I started as an area designer on Neverwinter Nights 2, and then worked on writing on Mask of the Betrayer, one of the DLCs. I then worked on Alpha Protocol for slightly longer than it took me to go through college. I did some area writing, but mostly I did systems design on that game. I then bounced to Fallout New Vegas and did area design on that game, and then back to systems design on Dungeon Siege 3. And then I was the lead designer of South Park: The Stick of Truth, pretty much the start to the finish of that. And then I kind of relaxed and just did some writing on Pillars of Eternity for a while. And then I moved to be the lead narrative designer on Tyranny, and then I worked as the project director on the Tyranny DLCs and the Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire DLCs. You'll probably hear me use the first-person plural with respect to Obsidian. I'll say us and we almost out of force of habit. I actually resigned from the company back in May to pursue my own malarkey. It's really too soon to talk about it, but people ask me, what's life going to be like after a serious game development job? Kind of like life before my serious game development job. Whenever someone's up on stage pretending to know anything about video games, it's always useful to figure out what they mean. There is no one-size-fits-all skill at making games. Each genre is a skill in of itself. So my background is primarily in choice-heavy power fantasies. I've made some trading card games, but largely I make these big overwrought RPGs where you're the hero, you save the world, you never suffer a serious setback. But most importantly, there's a lot of content that you can choose away. It's sort of expected that you'll make a series of 3 doors you can go through, and then 3 doors after that, and then 3 doors after that. On any one playthrough, the player sees only the 3 doors they chose, but you have to build all the 24 other doors, and that takes time. These games also just have almost inherent feature creep. You're expected to have combat, crafting, dialogue, big overwrought quests, simple open world quests. The genre just demands kitchen sink design that is inefficient. I've been blessed to do a whole bunch of different kinds of design work, systems, area, narrative, and management, but I've only ever done it in teams of like 20 to approaching 100. And I say this mostly to let you know that if you're in the indie space or you're working in a massive studio, maybe my advice isn't totally applicable to you, and sorry if that's the case. It's also worth noting that I'm old and obsolete. There were no, you just couldn't study game development when I was going to college, so I learned everything the hard way, which probably means I learned a lot of bad habits, so take everything I tell you with a grain of salt. And the other reason I'm telling you all about my biases is I want to tell you about how I encountered the theme for this GCAP event, the walls we build ourselves. When I read the speaker submission entry, it certainly had a negative connotation to walls, or at least I picked up on that. We talk about interpersonal communication walls. We talk about a bad team as throwing work over the walls to other departments. In my own experience, however, I've felt that walls are almost part of my growth. When I think about all the things I've done to develop as a game developer, a lot of it is building a wall against my naivete, what I think this game job should be versus what it actually is. And I wouldn't actually leap to the wall metaphor. There's been kind of a different way I've been perceiving all these slow bits of education I've had in my career. And that is what I'm calling the Iron Butler theory of game development. In fairness, it's probably more of a hypothesis, but why a butler? Because really every lesson I've come to over the years could be boiled down to this isn't about you being the awesome dungeon master telling a really cool story. It's about you serving your players. And this may be potentially obvious, hopefully it is. For me, at least, it was rarely intuitive. It was something I had to train into me. And why iron? Why not tungsten? Because there's plenty of room for this job to suck. It can be really rewarding. I've absolutely loved my career, but it is very painful at times. Which leads me to my first component of this theory of game development, and that is, know to serve the player first, you are served last. And this rule entirely breaks down if you're so well off that you can just afford to make a game and not worry about the audience finding it. If that's the situation you're in, you probably don't need any of my advice. For the rest of us, not failing means pretty much satisfying your core audience, and if you want any real success, that always almost means going beyond the audience you already have and just trying to branch out. And this job is tough because even when you do it right, you will see a lot of crap. Over the years, I've found I'm at some point getting compliments disguised as negative feedback. Some of the really funny ones, the best compliments I got from my game was like, I was playing your game, and on the 4th playthrough, I encountered this thing, and I really hated it. And I just want to say, well, I should stop you. You played the game 4 times. That's cool, but I don't think you hate it at this point. And I've also heard across multiple games, so I was playing a game, and I used this ability and this passive, plus this companion and a consumable, and then this thing, and it totally smoked this boss battle that should have been hard. Well, congrats, you used every tool we gave you in a brilliant manner. I'm sorry you're upset. I don't want to get up here and say that your job is to just absorb a whole bunch of shitty feedback, but players do give you shitty feedback, and in many ways, we maybe set them up for that. Games ask a lot of players. They ask for your time, your focus, and your money, and I think all of us have one of those to spare. Very rarely do we have all 3 to spare. And games can be really intimate and intense. We engage your critical thinking, your morality sometimes. In many ways, our games are built off of challenge and conflict and frustration. If we get so much negative feedback from players, it's probably because we're priming them to be in this antagonistic state of mind. So I'm not going to say that players are saints for yelling at us and being cruel on the internet, but I'm just saying that maybe it's a sign that we're doing our job, that they have played a game that's amped them up for conflict, and then they speak to us in words of conflict. You get a lot of good advice from negative feedback, as difficult it is to hear. And I wouldn't necessarily say that it is your job to just sit there and be insulted on the internet and internalize all of it, but I would say that the more noise you drown in, the more signal you're going to hear in the end. Ideally, you are aiming to gather your worst feedback before your game launches. And no doubt you work on a team where someone says to you, oh, I want the honest truth, just tell me everything unfiltered, and then you tell them everything unfiltered and they are offended and they never want to talk to you again. There could probably be a whole lecture on how best to work with people, but I think the one major point of advice I would take away from my career is that you should let coworkers change your mind. And when they do change your mind, you should get that person who changed your mind and tell them in front of other developers, hey, remember that dumb idea I had? Thanks for pointing out that it was stupid and I'm changing it. Maybe don't use those words exactly, but saying it in front of other developers lets everyone else know that you're a person who can be confronted with a potentially difficult bit of feedback, and they know that you're not going to bite their head off. Now, once your game does launch, I think it's your job to read as much about your game as you can stomach. Again, it's not your job to just internalize the negativity of the internet and hate yourself, but there can be very good feedback surrounded in all the vitriol. I always try to pair positive and negative reads. Read something positive, read something negative. Hopefully you've worked on a game that has a stack of both. If you only have positives, you probably don't need my advice. One thing I've learned to do is to always read negative feedback twice. I've sort of gotten to this point now where there's nothing you can say to insult a game I've made that I won't say, like, yeah, it was rushed out the door, it did suck. But I still can read negative feedback that I know a coworker who worked on that feature and I can feel bad. And sometimes you'll wince when you read negative feedback and you stop actually paying attention. So I've just gotten to the habit of always reading negative feedback twice. It's probably going to mean I have a shorter life expectancy, but I think it's good. And it's worth noting that if you're not serving the player, you are also serving, oftentimes, a business partner or a publisher. Games have been rising in cost to make, but they're largely a static cost to customers. When I was in high school, if I wanted to buy a really cool AAA game, it cost me about 60 American dollars. Nowadays, if I want to buy a really cool AAA game, it costs about 60 American dollars. The price to make those games has gone up catastrophically, and I don't want to make it sound like I'm excusing publishers from being jerks, but it's something you should understand, that market forces have sucked a lot of room for fun out of this career. They've taken a lot of the room for experimentation is lost because it's just expensive to iterate on games. So, in honor of our GCAP talk, I wanted to try to take my knowledge and break it down into wall logic. So to take this first component of the Iron Butler theory of game development, know to serve the player first and you are served last, I would say build a wall against the need to make the game fun for you. Because here's a hint, after you've been play testing it again and again and again, it's probably going to suck to you anyway. So remember, you're not the one being served. The player's being served. Your needs are served last. And I would say lower your walls against feedback in as healthy a fashion as possible, because this industry does burn people out. So I feel like this is very caustic advice to give you of dwell in negative feedback, but that is where you get a lot of room for improvement. And enjoy being wrong. If you can view being wrong as a chance to correct yourself, then I think you'll actually have a long game development career. The next component of the Iron Butler theory of game development would be know whom you are serving. You need to know that you are served last and the player is served first, but you need to know who you're serving. If you're kickstarting, this is easy. Your players have already come to you. They give you a huge list of expectations, but at least you know who they are. If you're working on an established IP, that usually means you have pre-existing fans, and you need to think very carefully about how you want to target them. When we were working on South Park: The Stick of Truth, we were kind of lucky in that if you were to look at the people who enjoy South Park the show, probably about 70% of them are already gamers. So we could make the calculation of let's target South Park fans, and they'll probably play this game. What we don't need to target is just the gamer who doesn't like South Park. And by not putting that on our radar, that helps streamline our decisions. Now, if you're working on a sequel, that's always going to bring with it an audience. It's also going to bring with it expectations about what the previous game didn't do, and you'll have to deal with their wish lists. Now, even if you understand your core audience, there's always going to be these little internal divisions that are easy to overlook, and it can take a whole career to get really good at this. I think the best way to talk about game development is to talk about where you screw up. At least I've always enjoyed post-mortem analysis of games and following that tradition. So I was working on this game called Tyranny. If you haven't played it, it's a computer role-playing game for the PC, and it is filled with lots and lots of dialogue, lots of reading. NPCs talk to you, and you choose from a list of dialogue options, and you say things back to them. There's also this complicated reputation system of fear and loyalty and wrath and favor with all these different characters. And one day, project director comes in and says, hey, I've got an idea. We should put in a little reputation preview. And after every single line of dialogue, we're going to let the player know what kind of change will happen if they select that idea. Isn't that great, right? Well, no, I flipped my lid, and I kept thinking, well, no, what about spoilers? What about being rewarded for paying attention? What about being punished for not paying attention? What about RPG gamers just like me? Is effectively what I was saying, and I cringed thinking back to my position, but that's how I felt. I thought I was standing up for a certain kind of player, and I was, in essence. Really, the correct answer was to make this an option. These little previews needed to be something that you could toggle, because I was standing up for one kind of player, and Brian Hines, the project director, he was also standing up for another kind of player that I just wasn't recognizing in that moment. He was standing up for the player who is very risk averse, and they don't like taking a decision that they thought was going to be the right thing, and then it's bad. They'll just hit reload and try it again and be more frustrated. So he was really catering to them. Now I think that if we had made this not an option, we would have alienated one side of our dinner party, so to speak. But the trick was to solve for both without annoying either. And then once we had made that decision, it was now my job to have fun with that. And I actually found ways to make the game a little better. I could have just one little moment where an NPC who's supposed to be your ally is like, hold on a second, I got to torture this person. And your options are like, say nothing, or wait, this seems a little messed up. By itself, most people will just be the white knight and say, hey, don't do that whole murder execution thing. But then suddenly if you put a preview on it saying, this person's going to hate you a lot of people are suddenly like, yeah, you just do your execution. We'll finish our conversation later. So you need to know whom you're serving, and let's break this down into our GCAP recap wall edition. Build a wall against how you think it should be played, because it is always just one version of how it could be played, and there's always someone out there who's going to enjoy your game differently. And you should lower your walls against what is a wrong way to play your game. If something seems like it's a wrong way to play your game, just ask yourself, is that just a different variety of player, that's a different style that they want to play that game? Your goal is to try to build for those multiple approaches. The next component of this theory, I'd say, is know what you are serving. You know who you're serving, you know the priorities that they get served first and you get served last. Now you need to know what you're making. And it isn't always obvious that you know what you're making. And also sometimes what you're making isn't exactly what players want. Brand new games have this the hardest. It is unknown territory, and the mystery you need to solve is what will people enjoy. Sequels and successors provide a good roadmap, and hopefully you'll get a chance at some point in your career to work on such a game, because it's really great to have a whole blueprint of a game to make and just a room to expand. And if you're working with Kickstarters, they may have so many demands that it actually becomes that what you're serving is less about what you want and more about what they want. When we were working on Pillars of Eternity, the promise to the Kickstarter backers was this very retro-style RPG. Now, plenty of us at the studio have been playing those games to death and wanted to do something a little different, and really our struggle was to pare it back and make sure that it really is the retro thing that's on the menu. Now, sometimes you're winging it. What if you know roughly the game you're going to make, and it's never been made before? Maybe this isn't a sequel, this is a brand new IP. Sometimes you have to have your sushi chefs make warm food. Sometimes you have to have vegetarians make imitation meats. Sometimes you get a game like Alpha Protocol. If you've played Alpha Protocol, you've probably encountered many bugs. It is a spy RPG that shipped on multiple platforms. This game took over 4 years to complete. We didn't actually assume it would take 4 years when we got started. We thought it would take about 1.5 years. But this game had just this huge thing it was trying to serve. It was a spy RPG. Well, what kind of spy franchise are you talking about? Do you mean Bourne? Do you mean Bond? Do you mean Bauer? We said yes to all of those. We're going to put all those together. And we didn't really know what we were making, because nowadays we live in this golden age where Deus Ex is constantly remade, but we hadn't got to that point yet. We were living in the dark ages of no new Deus Ex. So stealth was a feature that got put on the chopping block a little early on. It seemed out of scope, and normally when you You want to cut early, cut often. That's the smart thing to do, right? You're saving yourself time. You're being efficient. In this particular case, we were only creating ourselves more overall complexity. By taking away stealth, we just had to make the gunplay more complex. And this was a game that was aiming to be realistic. We didn't have ninjas and cyborgs and ninja cyborgs. We only had regular human beings that die when you shoot them in the head. So the only way to keep progressing the gameplay was to just fill the screen with bad guys. And we were just making complex Rambo. So here's another time I was wrong. When we were dealing with this stealth removed version of Alpha Protocol, we did a lot of experimentations, and one thing we did was we had shooting as a progression mechanic. You see a padlock, you shoot it. You see a support beam, you shoot it, and a bridge gets lowered down. And I said, well, wait, now we'll have progression breaks after an intense gunfight where you run out of ammo. We should make unlimited ammo, because besides, look at what we're serving. When did you ever see James Bond call Moneypenny and say, hey, I need 20 more bucks for extra bullets? Spies always tactically reload in the middle of combat, but they don't deal with their financier to get more bullets. Now, sure, running out of bullets wasn't fun, but neither was not caring about your ammo at all. And to make matters worse, we were very slowly getting in this really cool martial arts system, but it had a lot of motion capture involved. And anyway, by the time the system was online, we realized, oh gosh, you're never getting into a fist fight because you never run out of bullets. This seems counterintuitive. Why are we doing this? Now, fortunately, the game did shift back to a stealth-focused game. We realized that we're just going to make a disaster if we make a spy game without stealth, so we put it back in. And this allowed me to put a bullet in the head of the unlimited ammo design decision, fortunately. But I talk about this partly because if you make your misbegotten efforts into something, then it's never really a mistake. When we did get around to building the skills, I realized, hey, I already have an answer for the submachine guns. We just turn on the unlimited ammo code for a couple seconds. And this also let me get to the final economy design that I really wanted. I felt like there actually really was something good out of the unlimited ammo design, that it spoke to the part of spies don't run out of regular bullets generally. So we had this code already in place that when you went back to your safe house, we would just refill your regular bullets. It's worth wondering, how did we get into this mess? I mean, usually you know what you're making when you're making a game, right? You all show up to work and you're working on the same game. Kind of the simple answer is these things are big and complicated, and there's a lot of points of failure. But more importantly, sometimes you're making something that's just not really your current expertise. You need to get there, but you don't know how to make it yet. And when Alpha Protocol came out, the reviews were pretty harsh. But it was a good lesson in why I called this the Iron Butler theory of game design, and not just the butler. You will have to someday read probably negative reviews about your work. And in some ways, I don't wish a failure on anybody, but I actually think it is a good learning exercise to work on a game that is mixed on release. So you should know what you are serving. Let's explain this in our wall bullet points. I would say you should build a wall against the notion of more is better, because that often gets you in trouble. But what gets you even in more trouble is if you do not build a wall around the genre-defining features in your game. Because at some point, you're going to be behind on money or time or something, and you're going to think, hey, this would save us a lot of time if we cut this thing, but you're actually just going to be shooting yourself in the foot. The next component would be to know your kitchen. Now, it's routine advice that you should know who's on your team and work well with them, but what I really mean here is you need to know the strengths and weaknesses of your entire crew. You don't necessarily need to know what every single person does, but as a whole, ask yourself, what do we make best and what do we do fastest? And what's our most expensive limiting process? You should know your kitchen's strength. Ask yourself, what's the cheapest thing that we can get away with doing over and over again and still entertain the player? Because that's what you should be doubling down on. With Alpha Protocol, we may have suffered for building a first-person shooter game with a team that was mostly RPG veterans, but we knew that branch-link dialogue was something that we did well. I wouldn't call it cheap, it was very expensive, but we at least knew what we were doing. We had thought about this a lot, and we had a QA team that was very comfortable with the huge volume of bugs we created. When we were working on Pillars of Eternity, we wanted to have a lot of things like climbing walls, going through underground tunnels, but we knew that if we tried to do these all in cutscenes, we just didn't have the strength to make animations like that at that level. But we did know that we can do text and still artwork. Hell yeah. So we used that to do all the scenes that we would have done in expensive animations and never been able to deliver. So you should find your effort to feature sweet spot. If there's a thing you can accomplish relatively cheaply, and it's relatively fun to reuse, do it until it's done to death. On the other hand, you'll also need to know your kitchen's weakness. You should ask yourself, what's your most expensive limiting reagent? And what's the thing that you must do to make your game successful, but is going to come to you at the most expense? You should always be iterating against your weakness. At Obsidian, we certainly had a hard time with level content, as that was always the thing that took us the longest to build. It would be easier for us to make 3 areas with 9 quests cycling you around those 3 areas than to try and make 6 areas. We would always try to make more levels than we could anyway, and bugs became a problem too. Neverwinter Nights 2 was not especially bug-free. Alpha Protocol was a buggy mess. Fallout New Vegas was a buggy mess. So when we got to Dungeon Siege 3, one of the things that was an a-priority thing for this game was to not be a buggy mess. And it seemed like a good idea. This was a project that plays to our strengths, so this is a great time to shore up a process that we've been weak on. And once you've figured out the weakness of your kitchen, get ready to work on the next weakness. We did make a remarkably bug-free game. Dungeon Siege 3 was probably the most polished title of anything that's come out of Obsidian, and we managed to do it on a new engine that was made in-house. So we were developing our own engine and developing the game and still made a game with fewer bugs than Alpha Protocol or Fallout New Vegas. We thought, great, we're going to be well received in the scores, right? Well, no, not so much. The praise for the polish was erased by the meh for the multiplayer. In our blind zeal to make sure that this was a flawless and bug-free game, we cut out a lot of features of multiplayer that we knew were just going to be riddled with bugs and problems. This meant that there was a multiplayer system where your friends could join you, but they couldn't save their character. It was saved to your game. And that really turned off a lot of players that this couch co-op mode wasn't really the mode that they really wanted. If you know your kitchen really well, you'll know when to double down and what to do best when the situation gets tough. Fallout New Vegas was a computer role-playing game made for many consoles, and the roadmap for that game was Fallout 3, but more. And it's worth noting that we had a smaller team than Fallout 3 was made with, and we had much less time. And this created quite a challenge. There was lots to do, there was lots of crunch, and there was a lot of pressure to make more and bigger quests all the time. There's a couple reasons. We were always looking for these big marquee moments because it was nice to see other games being shown in YouTube, so I think all of us wanted to make that cool quest that gets shown on YouTube. But it's also a matter of, we were a studio that's known for big story, so we solve everything with big story, right? Well, at one point, the project director, Josh Sawyer, realized that we'll never get this game done if we don't shift our focus. And he sat all the area designers down, and he insisted on a shift to smalls. Smalls being, give me a dungeon, a mine shaft, an empty building, where there's a combat encounter, a story being told through a level design, but no new voice assets, no new art assets, just use what's already in your level design toolkit. His wisdom came, I think, both from understanding the kitchen he had, and also knowing how players actually enjoy this game. We all talk about the really cool quest line in a game, but we might sit down for a game and play maybe one or two of those quests in a night. The rest of that time, we're just farting around, shooting people in the head, drinking toilet water that gives us hit points back. It's Fallout. We'll spend time on these quests, but we'll spend most of our time just wandering around the wasteland. The project director recognized that the voiceover and art assets were becoming our limiting reagent, but design could crank out these art and VO-free encounters. And if we were willing to sacrifice a quest, we could make a bunch of these little smalls. And if we were willing to get rid of a bunch of quests, we could just fill the Mojave Wasteland with some actual content. And if you've played Fallout New Vegas, you know that there are some bald patches of little content. There would have been even more of that if the project director hadn't made this about-face late in development. So you need to know your kitchen, and let's explore that with our GCAP recap. You should accept that your team's limitations represent a wall to your ambitions. You might be able to solve that by throwing money and expanding your team, but you shouldn't try to take the team you have over that wall. You should instead lower your wall against any design decision that is keeping you from taking advantage of your effort to feature sweet spot. Whatever you're doing best, make sure you're always geared to be doing that. The last component is you should know how it's enjoyed. We know who our guests are, we know what we're serving them, we know the priority that they get served before us, but we also need to think about how they enjoy the content you create for them. As I was bringing up that story with Fallout New Vegas, I think Josh's wisdom was based both on knowing the kitchen and also knowing how the dinner party wanted to sample the food, so to speak. Because there's always the experience you want for them and the way they'll actually play the game. I think there's kind of three games you make in game development. There's the first game you make, which is in the Blue Sky production and all those meetings. It sounds really great. There's the second game you make that is the one you play test over and over again and learn to hate. Then there's the third game you make that is the game that the players see and they play it and they unbox it and they don't have you to help them through it. So your goal really is to aspire to anticipate the needs of as many kinds of players as you can manage while embracing the fact that you cannot anticipate all of them. I know that's probably a ridiculous demand. It certainly helps if you play a lot of games. It helps if you have an obsessive personality. Helps if you love being wrong. And it certainly helps if you're not precious about your work. But it's worth saying, I think most developers are gamers. I actually kind of hope we're all gamers. There might be some of us who absolutely hate games but make them for a living anyway. And it is natural for us to assume that our preferences both speak for others and are maybe somehow more enlightened because we think about our preferences more, so somehow our opinion's better. I mean, you can see why we get into that mind space. Certainly, I got that way in Tyranny when we were working on the game. We had this stronghold system envisioned because all RPGs have far too many systems. And this game, too, also needed to have a stronghold system. You would be taking over these giant stone towers in the landscape that you magically unlock, and they become your strongholds for your friends to join you and resupply you and stuff like that. But of course, as a lead narrative designer, I was like, my immersion! How could you possibly be recruiting people to a giant tower in the sky with no elevator and no safety rails, and they're all going to die? And it's a stupid complaint. Really, the only valid problem I had was the name. At first, these things were called the Sky Pillars. Meanwhile, we're working on a game called Pillars of Eternity, and I thought, maybe we should change the name so we don't sound so self-plagiarizing. Beyond that, though, I was really kind of just grumpy about my immersion. All my other concerns would have led to what? We cut the stronghold system? That'd be a bad idea. We not use the art assets? Not a good idea. My mistake was assuming that a feature would be experienced exactly as I experienced. Now, it's possible that there was like 20 or 30 people who actually felt that way about the strongholds in Tyranny and were like furious about their immersion and formatted their hard drives in disgust. But those people would have found something to hate anyway. So you really shouldn't be factoring them into your thinking anyway. A really good bit of advice I got once was to think of game design as working on a cathedral, or fresco in a cathedral. And I don't think it was said in a way to like mystify or elevate game development. I think it was just an actual like physical metaphor. When you were up in the scaffolding and you were working with the brushstrokes on this little bit of painting, and you're involved in the details, you can turn your head in either direction and you see a whole lot of other painting, and you'd almost be right to think, hey, I've got the big picture of it all. But you don't. The only person who has anything close to a good vantage point is the person standing on the floor, like say a project director or something like that. If you are doing your job right, it should be hard for you to grasp the whole thing you're looking at. And even when it is your job to have the big picture in mind, when you're standing on the ground, you're only ever looking at one slice of the cathedral at a time, and you need to be cognizant of when you are staring in one direction too long. And you certainly shouldn't be up in the scaffold doing too much of that work on your own. Certainly if you're in a small team, a director or producer has to do some actual detail work, but the more you are working on the details, the less you'll understand the big picture. So you need to know how your game is enjoyed. Let's do the GCAP recap wall edition bullet points here. I would say you should build a wall against your own preferences. You are but one savant of the genre. Your opinion may be one that you've thought about plenty, but it's just one. And you should accept that your focus presents a wall against seeing the whole thing. You think you have more perspective than you actually do. So that's the Iron Butler theory of game design. Let's go over this again. You should know to serve your player, partner, publisher first. You are served last. You should know whom you are serving. You should know what they like to be served. You should know your kitchen, what it's good at, what it's bad at. And you should know how it should be enjoyed. Now, like any good theory, this is under development. There are parts about this I don't really like. I certainly don't like that first point in some degree, because I do feel like this job can be difficult. And it's not about you having no ego at all. It's just that if you have a strong ego, I think you'll break when you should be bending in the wind. And that last point kind of bothers me too. Know how it's enjoyed seems really limiting, and kind of like I'm suggesting just recycle the same vomit and you're doing the right thing. I'd edit this a little bit. I'd say that really rule number 5 should be know how it's enjoyed by most people so far. Because there's a 6th part of this Iron Butler theory of game development, and that is, if and only if you figured out all the above, then you should assert a new way to experience things. And I also feel like that first point could be maybe a little modified to be that you are served almost last. You certainly need to keep your own needs in perspective. If you burn out, you're not helping anybody. Now for that last point, sometimes you have to take a risk or two. I sometimes feel guilty talking about Alpha Protocol. Its best feature was the dialogue stance system, and it really had nothing to do with me. That was the system where you'd have this real-time dialogue system, and someone would be saying something to you, and you didn't get to choose your exact words. You could choose like suave, aggressive, professional, something like that. And then you had a very limited time, basically when the person was done speaking, to choose your response. And you never chose your exact words. You would just get what Mike Thornton would want to say as a professional, aggressive, or suave spy. Now, I consider myself like the 4th biggest fan of this feature in the office. It had a bunch of people at the company who thought, like, this is going to bury us. This is a terrible idea. And even I had my doubts. I kind of applied my own, I wouldn't call it the Iron Butler theory of game development yet, but I would put those criteria to the test. So were we making something that serves us first or the player first? Like, this sure started seeming to feel like something that is something that we, the developers, like. Are we putting our preferences first? And we had to think about whom we're serving. The fans of RPGs that we've made so far, they've always been reading at their own leisure, and they just think of the dialogues as the slower part of the game. That's when they want to stop and think. what are you doing making this a stressful game? Are they really going to like this? And then I had to think, well, what are we serving? We're making a spy RPG. It needs to have tension, confusion. Oh, yeah, okay, this is perfect for a spy RPG. And I had to think about the kitchen. If we actually made these dialogues with pause points, we could test it a hell of a lot easier. Like, half the problem is that this was such a hard game to QA. But then I had to think about how it's enjoyed. And believe it or not, a lot of people who play this game really did like that part of the dialogues. They liked that the tension was just unlike anything that they'd seen before. And even I tried to fight against the system because I liked it, but I thought, oh man, so many of our players are going to hate this thing. And when I was responsible for the skills design, I kept wanting to, or flirting with the idea of adding speech skills. Like maybe there's something that slows down the timer so you have more time to think or gives you a hint at what the other person might like to hear. But I felt that that rubbed up against my own like core philosophical pillar of if you have XP going into like shooting and more hit points, it shouldn't also go into speech skills because you'll always be shooting more bad guys, but each conversation is one time only. So that just creates a situation where you always want to front load your speech skills. Anyway, the right answer was to just actually keep the system there, but give you rewards for doing it, for using it in interesting ways. Tell a bunch of lies, get a perk. Tell the truth all the time, get a perk. Act erratically, get a perk. Use the same stance the entire game, get a perk. I also was desperately trying to think of a way to work an optional pause into this because I kept thinking like we're just going to expand our audience, right? Like we're turning off so many people with this dialogue system that doesn't let you sit back and read. Wouldn't an optional pause just make this game so much better? Like going back to that example on tyranny, that the spoilers on the dialogue reputation indicators, those were best as an option. Shouldn't this be also an option? And no, frankly. The minute you make that an option, everyone turns off the timers, you lose the tension, and you lose what we were trying to serve. It stopped being a tense spy RPG. So you need to find the right amount of newness. The dialogue stance system shipped very much as initially envisioned, with a fast forward, but no slow motion, no pause. It was internally polarizing all the way past the ship date, actually. I remember the game was going out, there's a bunch of people being like, yep, this is going to bury us. But it was the thing we needed to serve. And if imitation is a sign that you're doing something right, the dialogue stance system may have been a risky feature, but a whole bunch of games have been made with a system very, very similar to it. And I showed you that slide earlier that had Alpha Protocol rated at 63. I do hope that if you do work on a game that is poorly reviewed, I hope that you have the joy of it becoming a cult classic and getting appreciated at least later. Over a long enough timeline, someone is going to enjoy your work. The best feedback I've gotten for any game I've ever worked on came just as an email to our support@obsidian.net one day. It's about a year and a half after Alpha Protocol had shipped, and this was a man who described himself as severely autistic and had a very hard time dealing with social situations. But he said our game and the dialogue stance system was actually very educational to him. He said, oh wow, I hadn't thought about it, that it's up to me to choose how I present myself, and sometimes I'm supposed to mirror people's emotions. Sometimes they don't want to have their emotions mirrored. And he said that the timer gave him really great practice. So by thinking about how, like, what emotion he should use in any given moment in this game, it actually helped him in his real life. So make a crazy, risky feature. Someday it might change someone's life. So this last hidden sixth rule, if and only if all of the above, assert a new way to experience things. Let's break this down into wall logic, shall we? I think most of what I'm talking about would be the advice to lower the walls that stand between you and success. But at the same time, I would say you should maybe raise a few obstacles in your path. Maybe raise obstacles at first, and then maybe raise walls in your path, because how else are you going to level up? If you keep inflicting some challenge on yourself and just the right amount of challenge, you're going to make yourself a better developer, you're going to make a better studio, you're going to make a better game, and hopefully you're going to make other people's games better. With that, I would just like to thank you all. I'd like to thank our sponsors once more, and I'd like to thank the folks who made this speech possible. It wasn't just me. I had people behind the scenes helping me out. And I've hopefully left room for questions and also statements and exclamations. Any questions? Anyone? Anyone? Seriously?
You've done such a good job.
What?
You did such a good
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Want me to just jibber-jab for a little bit? Oh, great, questions.
Oh, firstly, I would say I really like New Vegas. It's actually my favorite one after two.
Well, thank you.
When you were working on that, like, I didn't play it initially when you launched it, so there were a lot of bugs, and you guys got hit a lot for that. So
Yes.
I played it a lot later.
Yes.
How did you feel? Were you being rushed a bit by the publisher to get that out? Like, was that a pressure you were under?
Yes, we were absolutely under pressure to get things out. That's always the case, right? I couldn't recall how many times the game was delayed versus like original launch date versus when we actually shipped, but yeah, there was always the pressure to be done and get it out now. Yeah, it was a very stressful project. I think we're all really proud of what it is and what it was, but like it was a lot of work and a lot of crunch. So.
And how do you get the feedback afterwards, like when you're fixing all those things? Because I know sometimes bugs can stay in the game for a very long time, and I guess you're prioritizing it, so using what you talked about today.
Yeah, in a game like Fallout New Vegas, we had a couple advantages. We had really large install base across a lot of different consoles, so we got plenty of feedback. We, of course, found out that the PS3 was especially buggy, but it was good that, because we were also working with Bethesda, which is a large corporation, they had their technical support helping us too. I think we had plenty of feedback from the players to work on patches. Unfortunately, sometimes people review your game based on their first impressions, so, you make a bunch of patches, but it's too late. People already kind of think the game's really buggy. So, other questions?
How do you know which feedback to listen to?
That's a great question. So much of it is negative, useless rambling. Like if someone says, I played your game on the 4th time and da-da-da-da-da, they probably don't hear your game if they played it 4 times, but listen to the thing that came after that because they care about it. I guess the quick answer I'd say is anything I hear mentioned 3 times, I make a note of. I also try to look for the people who are really ranting about something and try to figure out what they're angry about. Like oftentimes they might be angry about this quest, but they were angry about just the fact that they couldn't make one decision on the quest. They liked every other part of it, but because they the final decision made me mad, they'll forget the previous part of it. So yeah, I guess I make a note of the things I see most frequently, and then I try to find the ones that have the most heart in them, because there's usually something. It's not what they're saying exactly. It's like trying to figure out their point of failure. I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but I guess that's how I go about it.
A follow-up question. What about in your team? Or is it the more angry you get about it, the more you should listen to that person?
Hopefully not. I mean, I've always tried to be just someone who doesn't get mad when I get feedback, and I try to go through my day pretending like, hey, I'm an idiot making decisions twice as fast as I'd like to be making them, so they're probably going to be wrong, so tell me when I'm wrong, and I'll deal with it. Not everybody has that mentality. Gosh, I mean, I've worked with a bunch of very strong personalities, but I guess we always should be fighting for what the player is going to enjoy. And I think a lot of our discussions came down to we're disagreeing on how people are enjoying it because we're talking about how we want to enjoy it. And we need to silence our particular preferences and think about who's actually playing the game. Yes, sir.
You've obviously had a sort of worked on a spectrum of work, including original IPs and then hyper-licensed stuff like South Park.
Yeah.
How does, I guess, all of this change when the clamps are on, such as South Park? So obviously that's so tightly monitored, from what I imagine, maybe, and entwined with the existing IP.
In that case, we're almost serving the business partners more than we're serving the players.
Yeah.
On that project, for sure, it was very much South Park was the customer. They have a process where they're always changing their minds and refining, and we had to be ready to completely scrap levels and remake them. It's funny, that was the one game where VO wasn't the limiting reagent. We got free, awesome top-line VO from these guys every week they were in to make the show. They'd give us temporary VO batches, so it's like, on that particular project, the VO budget wasn't a problem, but say animation was. And we also had these problems with, they wanted Nazi zombies in the game, so we had to have a separate build for Germany, and yeah. So certainly, I think that's why I said in the first part, you're usually serving the player, but every once in a while it's your business partner or your publisher that comes first, because that's unfortunately the job. So,
Thank you.
welcome.
Talking about your dialogue system in Alpha Protocol, so the first part of the question is, when you're dealing with a feature like that, do you then at some point go away and do sort of QA testing? Like at what point do you bring in the data to sort of say what this impact's having? And then how do you test a feature like that and look at its holistic impact on the project rather than just in isolation?
Sega had one sort of a feedback meeting where we watched people through the one-way glass and asked them a lot of opinions on that. I don't think we did enough testing of the feature, to be honest. I think it was a lot of just cavalier, let's make it happen. Strangely enough, the QA folks became the lore keepers of the game because it got so complicated. There was one of the most memorable days of work was the whole lead team just sitting in the room and having Anthony Rogers in QA explain to us all the endings, because he's the only one who knew all the endings in the game that we had all added. And he's like, no, there's 17, no, 18. It's like, there's 30-something, he says, and writes us out a list. So we actually really had just a brilliant QA staff that was always thinking about like the possibility space of like, if you could do this over here and then you skip this boss battle here, it'll be different here. So we didn't actually do a whole lot of testing, we just had a great QA team. You back there.
I want to ask about Vegas. I mentioned the shift to small quests later on in development. Did that carry over very well into the development of the DLCs?
Not exactly, because with the DLCs it was more like we were trying to create little siloed content of like, you know, here's Old World Blues, it's going to be kind of more comic styling in this separate location. And then sometimes we wanted more empty space as part of the exploration. The small thing I think really came out of the fact that like at the time, Skyrim hadn't come out yet, so I don't think people realized the joy of just getting lost and choosing a direction and having fun. Like we were playing Fallout 3 that way, but I think we were all still thinking about the quests, and reviewers were always talking about the quests. So I think in many ways, that shift towards smalls was validated by seeing Skyrim do the same thing. Like they have a handful of quests, but they spent way more time just filling the world with little blops of stuff, because that's how you consume a game like that. So, yes, sir.
Well, do you have any social media platforms we can follow you on?
Not yet.
Good. What was it like working with Matt and Trey?
I actually kind of liked it. No, I would love to work with him again, so I want to be careful how I word it. No, I got this feedback in one of my reviews where it's like, yeah, there was that one moment where we were in that meeting in South Park, and Trey says, man, I want the most complicated fart system ever made, and the room fell entirely silent. And then suddenly Matt MacLean said, well, we can use the dual analog sticks and measure both the position and the degree to which you push the stick. So it was a lot of fun. We would go up to their offices every week or so and have these really great meetings about adventures in a man's colon. Yeah, it was a great time.
Did you pitch the project to them, or did they come to you?
They came to us, actually. They had a goofy little video demo of like the new kid walking through the street. In fact, the first 5 minutes of the game where your parents tell you to go make friends because they want to go have sex, and you go to Cartman's house and join their game. That was in their little pitch. That was like their proof of concept was that the first 5 minutes of the game. And it was the only thing that didn't get changed a billion times over. So that's cool. Anything else? Anybody else? Yes, sir.
So you tried to guard against this kind of question with a grain of salt, but you spoke about the cathedral scaffold viewpoint, but speaking in Australia where the team sizes are often like 5.
I know, yeah.
If you were to chop that view up a bit for a team where, you know, often the creative director or whatever title they've given themselves is also doing a lot of the detailing, could you possibly hypothesize a way to apply that?
Oh, sure. To be honest, as a project director, I also had a bunch of narrative design duties, and I often regretted the amount I put on myself. I tried desperately to push things off to other people, and I don't think it's impossible to work on details and work on the big picture at the same time. I certainly have a hard time doing it. I don't know if that's a personal failing or just a thing that all people should avoid trying to do. But I think it helps in some ways if you're working on some detail of the game, you need to have somebody else on the team that tells you no. In my case, like I had a couple other writers I worked with. I technically outranked them, but I let them tell me what was going on because I was busy worrying about project direction. I wasn't really working out the details, and I was also not really getting the big picture. So I just made myself subordinate in certain elements because I knew I had these blind spots, and that's kind of how I tried to solve it. I don't know if it was the best solution. The real solution should have been delegate all the details to somebody else. But any other questions? Cool. I guess that's it then. Thank you so much for your time.